I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, what can centuries of Indigenous knowledge teach us about the world?
I'm Malika Bilal. In the final show of our Indigenous Views series, we'll consider how Indigenous communities have advanced science, often to the benefit of all. Send us your comments via Twitter and the YouTube chat.
My name is Lee Francis IV. I am the CEO and founder of the Indigenous Comic-Con, and you are in the stream.
To most of us, the word science conjures up images of laboratories, experiments and big textbooks. But Indigenous peoples around the world have their own very different systems of knowledge that have advanced human understanding.
Indigenous knowledge, also known as traditional knowledge, is founded and maintained by Indigenous communities. The experiences of tribal members within the natural world are passed down the generations by word of mouth. Indigenous knowledge is key to understanding an array of different science fields. This clip from the Center for International Governance Innovation has some examples.
Traditional knowledge means different things to different people. It may relate to genetic resources, plants, animals, insects that are native to the area where that particular community resides.
Indigenous peoples have an insight into sustainable development and conservation and protection of biodiversity, and that there's something important in that we need to hear.
When Indigenous people suffer from illnesses from microbes, what have they done to combat those illnesses? Have they used plants? Have they used some food? These are clues to potential sources of medicine.
Well, joining us to discuss this, Tero Mustanin is a researcher in Indigenous and traditional knowledge, as well as climate change. He's also a lead author in the forthcoming 6th report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He joins us from Selkie Village, North Karelia in Finland.
And also from Corvallis, Oregon, we have Samantha Chisholm-Hatfield. She is a postdoctoral research associate at Northwest Climate Science Adaptation Center, and she is an enrolled member of the Silex Indian Tribal Confederation. Hello, it's great to have you. So Malika and I were in this big editorial meeting earlier on today, and we were throwing around terms and trying to work out what the terms meant and how broad they were. And then that phrase, traditional ecological knowledge, popped up, and then I said, how are we going to start this conversation, Malika?
And that's just one of the terms that our community is using and people in the know are using. Here is a good breakdown from the conversation. It's a research and academic site. They write, in recent years, many scholars have become aware of the large body of information known as traditional knowledge, TK, Indigenous knowledge, IK, or traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, amongst other terms. So an umbrella term there as traditional knowledge. But to break it down even further, we got this comment. This is Kyle Powes White. He is an environmental art activist and professor, and he writes, not all Indigenous peoples use the same terms, but when they do, it oftentimes refers to the fact that as Indigenous people over generations, we develop systems for gaining a reliable understanding of the world around us. Samantha, that seems like a good definition. How would you define Indigenous knowledge?
I really admire Dr. Powes White. He and I just co-authored a paper, and I respect his views highly. I think he's very, very in the know. I actually term it differently, and there are multiple people who define TEK and IK and TK differently. I use TEK more as a noun or a verb, and TK as a noun, because I break it down in many sections of traditional knowledges. You can have the knowledge but not actually apply it. And I define TEK as the application and utilization of that traditional knowledge. So it varies from people to people, and I think that it's up to the person, the individual, and the tribal community that utilizes it.
Samantha, so now you've given us the acronyms, do you want to give us an example?
Well, TK and TK, traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, would be primarily the terms that I use for Native Americans. I've used Indigenous knowledge because Indigenous can mean, a people that is Indigenous over long periods of time for any span of time in their place. They know that place very, very definitively over, say, 4 or 5 generations. There is another term that NOAA uses that is called local ecological knowledge, or LEK, and that is separate, and many people don't understand that LEK is quite different from TEK or TK.
Samantha, I'm in acronym soup right now, so I'm going to leave the acronym soup there just for a moment, because what I wanted to do was to take us into this different worldview that we're seeing. So if we look at Indigenous science, for instance, Jonathan, an example of how perhaps an Indigenous community might look at fishing and the way the rest of us approach fishing, that might be a good way to get people up to speed with what we're talking about. Can you give us that fishing example, Jonathan?
Yeah, so in my worldview, and a lot of people I work with, we're moving away from these ideas of TEK, you know, traditional knowledge, and calling it Indigenous Science. That's an important distinction, I think, because this science is still alive today. It's not, it's from the ancient past, of course, but it's still alive today. Some of the things we see now, you know, and I'll point to an example right here in Oregon. Less than 200 years ago, let's say, around 200 years ago, Lewis and Clark came here. And in their journals, they wrote about the first salmon ceremony, which during the salmon runs here in the Northwest, the first pulse of salmon, the tribal people had selected people to go out and fish that very first pulse. They caught these salmon, they brought them in, and from that they made a determination of how many salmon should be taken that year. And it was fish management, so that's fish science, just like we do today, but it was in their own way. Very important because they understood the consequences of getting it wrong, and the consequences of getting it wrong were there were no fish the next year for them to eat. There wasn't a Safeway or a grocery store they could run off to and get some food if the salmon didn't come. So they were very careful about that. Today, though, we see our fish management practices are driven by the dollar, and they're driven to catch the very last fish. Indigenous people understood through their science that's the wrong move, because if you don't have fish next year, you're going to starve.
All right, and I should say that Jonathan Waterhouse is joining us from Portland, Oregon, and he's an Indigenous people scholar at the Portland State University, and he's spent more than a decade working with tribes and First Nations in the Yukon watershed. Tero, a lot of the information that we're getting right now, if we're looking at this Indigenous science and what it is helping us understand, climate change, that is a big one, where the Indigenous communities are seeing climate change before anybody else. You have a story about beetles that gives us a perfect understanding of what we're talking about. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah. Here in the European North, there are a multiple range of peoples, and the Sami people are the indigenous peoples in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. And we established the very first co-management regime for an Atlantic salmon stream of Natama River, with the understanding that what could we do to complement scientific assessments of how climate change is having an impact on the salmon and on the rivers with some indigenous knowledge. And to jump right into the answer with the beetle, some years ago, the Skolt Sami knowledge holders actually detected the first ever observation of a southern beetle species that had moved in from the more southern latitudes. And then this particular observation was later confirmed by science and registered in all sorts of journals. But the point here is that when we discuss indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, the scales of how things are observed are not only limited to big iconic animals like polar bears or whales or even salmon. The beetle example shows that these are in some way the first line of observation makers and first responders to changes that are underway.
I like that you mentioned being the first responders. It's not something that someone might think about when it comes to beetles and the beetle population, but then what that could mean for human populations is interesting. Veldon here on Twitter picks up on that same idea of northern indigenous peoples, such as the Inuit, have compiled thousands of years of environmental observations that are now informing our view of how the climate is changing in the most extreme places on Earth. And in this case, the Arctic, and how the ice is changing. So tangential, but related to what you were saying there. I want to play a video comment next from someone else with some pretty specific examples. This is George Nicolas. He's an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And this is what he told the stream.
Native medicines such as the use of willow bark have contributed to the development of modern aspirin and other products. Balsam root and birch bark and other plants that were traditionally used for healing are known to have antimicrobial and antifungal properties, as demonstrated by laboratory studies, and are now being examined by pharmaceutical companies. And here on the northwest coast, the ancient practice of constructing clam gardens increased shellfish productivity for harvesting. It is now being put back into practice thousands of years later. However, too often indigenous knowledge is exploited without acknowledgement or recompense to the communities that hold the knowledge. It's critical that they benefit from outsiders' use of their cultural heritage.
So Samantha, I, for one, did not know that aspirin originated with willow bark. Does that resonate with you? Are there other examples within what he said? There are constructing clam gardens, lots of things there that your average person may not know about.
Right. The thing that is really important to understand is that some of those medicines are accurate that he denoted, but different tribes have different policies, and there is intellectual property rights that have to be taken into account. So sharing widely a medicine could be used erroneously, or it could be exploited to the point where that indigenous population cannot use it any further for their own ceremonial ways. And that's really important to safeguard, since the parameters of what is used, how it's used, where it's used, when it's used, and who it's used by are very different in the Western mainstream world compared to indigenous culture values. So one of the things to look into is what can be shared and what should be shared, because some of those medicines have gone away because of oversharing and exploitation and non-sustainable manners.
Yes, Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to expand on that a little bit, because and you're exactly right, it has been exploited down through the ages. In this modern world we live in now, I honestly believe that indigenous science and modern science, contemporary science, should not be in conflict, although they are. And they should not be in conflict, they should be complementary of each other. But through these times of exploitation, out through the years, through the centuries, it's become a huge problem. A good example right now is the Matsas people that live in Brazil and Peru. They have medical knowledge that is basically off the charts. And they have created a 500-page document of their medical knowledge, but it's written in their language. So it cannot be stolen and exploited by, let's say, big pharma or these, the large corporations. So that's a protection of their medical knowledge. But at the same time, as we look at that, why should there be that conflict? Why can't we have this respectful approach to each other so we can share this knowledge that could possibly save some lives, or at least improve people's lives?
Jonathan,
it's a big question these days.
Jonathan, I have to show our audience something. This is from the World Intellectual Property Organization, and they're really with you on the idea that we shouldn't be having to steal other people's knowledge and science. We should be able to work together. So they put together a fictional story of how indigenous communities can work with maybe big pharma and big corporations and work together. Have a look.
I organized a meeting and we agreed to talk with the cosmetics company. We expressed our concerns that their anti-aging cream used our traditional knowledge. We also explained how their trademark was given the impression that the cream was an authentic Yakuanoi product, benefiting my community. This was not the case. After a series of productive discussions, the company agreed to resubmit their patent and trademark applications with the Yakuanoi as co-owners.
So before you all start looking up the Yakuanoi tribe, they do not exist. That was an example of the future and what is possible. Tero, what is possible with your science that you're working on right now with Indigenous communities? What are you up to?
Well, I think one of the urgencies here in the Eurasian North comes in two forms. The other one is, of course, climate change impacts in themselves. For example, 2 years ago, we saw in Siberia the outbreak of anthrax as the permafrost is melting from some of these campsites of nomadic indigenous peoples. And one small young boy died because of this anthrax was leaked into the population. So there are all sorts of completely new events which are coming forward. The second one, which we are trying to put in place with indigenous knowledge, is ecological restoration, so that we would have more sites, more safe havens for birds, fish, animals, spawning areas restored and so forth as things get worse. So that it's really the urgency of day to day that we try to do here, and the messages like the anthrax are very disturbing. We are not far away from having a smallpox as well on the table, and as the permafrost is melting, and these should be the kind of issues that are brought forward.
So I like that you ended your statement with that these are the sort of issues that should be brought forward, because we got a tweet from Alice here, and she says sometimes this knowledge has not been shared with outsiders, but in many, many cases, the communities have been willing to share. So why did no one listen until it's been reported by scientists? She goes on to posit a theory of why she thinks that is. Alice on Twitter says, for one thing, we academics and media, the general public, we have a bias towards the new. So that knowledge has been long held is not as likely to generate clicks or publications as something that has just been, quote unquote, discovered. So Jonathan, on this theme of the conflict between Western medicine and indigenous knowledge and indigenous medicine, keep that in mind, keep that tweet in mind, because I want to play a video comment from Kyle White, who you heard from a little bit earlier at the top of the show. Kyle is also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and this is his take on that conflict.
Traditional ecological knowledge oftentimes places a lot of emphasis on the idea that knowledge keepers should be transparent and accountable and trustworthy to the people in their communities that they serve, and that they should be respected for the work that they do. Scientific bodies often dismiss traditional ecological knowledge due to racism and cultural discrimination that erases Indigenous peoples' histories and the ways that Indigenous people use traditional ecological knowledge to support their efforts in addressing today's challenges.
So Jonathan, I'm going to throw that one to you, but I know Samantha's been nodding as I was reading those tweets and played that video comment, so I know she has something to say. Jonathan, you go first.
Well, so I think modern society ignores the indigenous science at its own peril. You know, there's instance after instance of this, going back generations to even the Maya, when a fellow named Diego de Landa burned their codexes, which was their knowledge that was thousands of years of knowledge. This is knowledge that's now been lost to the world. And as we go forward, there is a way that the indigenous people have interacted with the planet through generations. When a true indigenous person looks out across the land, they don't see, you know, linear board feet of lumber or in a tree, or, you know, or I own that water and I'm going to bottle it and sell it to you. They see all of their relations. They understand that they're part of that system. To ignore that is more in the Western Eurocentric context, to ignore that we're actually part of this system and we have to work in balance with it. And that's something I think modern society should really deeply think about and maybe learn from the indigenous people.
Samantha, go ahead.
It's a value system of reciprocity and sustainability, understanding that you must be sustainable. And you are part of this circle. You are part of all of those beings, whether they're, you know, you consider them alive or just sentient. You are part of that coexistence that comes back to you. It's really important, and it really conflicts with Western value systems. of owning and property value, unfortunately. Well, that's,
Sure.
really detrimental to the system.
There's a Canadian not-for-profit organisation that's trying really hard to get young people from Indigenous communities involved in science. Have a look at some of what they're doing.
ACTUA is Canada's leading science, technology, engineering, and math outreach organization. On an annual basis, we're partnering with 200 Indigenous communities and engaging 35,000 youth.
It's really about getting to know the community and building trusting relationships with them and ensuring that they understand that we're not there to tell them what to do, but we're there to find out what they need and work directly with them. This technology is a tool, it's not a replacement for their cultural knowledge, and for us to be able to find ways to align those two sets of knowledges.
Tero, this is so important. The idea is that future Indigenous scientists are coming from the Indigenous community. So critical. What are you seeing?
Two things. There will be a tremendous transformation, perhaps even a loss of nomadic and traditional lifeways as we enter more into this century, and the silicon obsession, if you will, with all the iPhones and Facebooks is being immersed with the young people. So there will be a moment where we will lose a large portion of oral histories, place-based knowledges and practices. This will happen. And these territories that were utilized by Indigenous peoples, often, for example, in the Arctic, will be then utilized by mining companies and others. There won't be a void. It will be a natural resources century. Now, we should find ways of getting those young people back in land-based activities, and there, if it's well done, natural sciences and training like that might play a role. They could be conducting community-based monitoring of how things are changing, combining that with the main thing, in my opinion, which is that how do we maintain women and men on the land? We are losing, and in a situation where traditional knowledge is becoming too academic. We are losing the fishermen, the women, the reindeer herders, and the hunters out in the camps. What do we do about that? Well, we have to create a century where it's viable and meaningful to stay in those places and live a good life there.
Here's one other solution or suggestion via Twitter. Michael says, develop STEM projects that help Indigenous communities work with First Nations, this is out of Canada, to do that, and then train young Indigenous people to run the facilities. Canada would be solving its only challenges, but also creating ideas and products that might interest others throughout the globe. And of course, that can be expanded to more than just Canada. Jonathan, what do you make of that?
Well, I think in our modern society, it's our burden and also our responsibility to find that perfect blend. Again, balance between the modern and the traditional. As Tero said, how are we going to make it where these people can live on the land and live in places they have lived for thousands of years and participate in their culture as the modern society comes roaring towards them. And we meet today a lot of students. They want to go off to the university, but when they're done, they want to go home to their culture and their people, to help their people and move their society ahead. So I think it is our burden to find a way, that pathway to be able to do that properly and respectfully, respectful of their culture. It's a big burden, it's a huge responsibility, but I think we can find our way.
All right, thank you so much, guests. Really appreciate your insight this afternoon, today. And Malika, what do you have?
Well, I'll give our last word to our viewers on YouTube. Antonia says, traditional knowledge isn't just a cerebral knowledge, it is knowledge of the mind, the body, and the soul with connection to the earth.
Thank you very much to Jonathan, to Tero, and also to Samantha. Really appreciate you being here with us on the stream. You can continue commenting on this topic on Twitter, YouTube, and at aljazeera.com/the stream. Bye for now. See you soon.